The city of Darakvon pulsed with an eerie silence, an unnatural hush that spread across the gathered throngs like a weighted shroud. Twin suns bled their dying light over the vast alien metropolis, casting the execution square in long, wavering shadows. Towering structures of smooth obsidian metal loomed above, their surfaces reflecting the ghostly glow of bioluminescent banners emblazoned with the sigil of the Wander Dominion. At the heart of it all, beneath the cold, imperious gaze of the Supreme Arbiter, stood a boy, human, young, defiant even in the face of death. Nathaniel Mason's hands were bound behind his back, the restraints biting into his wrists. His dark hair clung to his bloodied forehead, his once clean clothes now torn and sullied from the relentless interrogations he had endured. Yet his eyes, green as shattered emeralds, burned with something far more dangerous than fear, defiance. A ripple of unease passed through the watching crowd, comprised of both Wander nobles and the enslaved human laborers who had been forced to bear witness. A figure stepped forward, draped in ceremonial crimson, his reptilian features impassive yet regal. Supreme Arbiter Velser regarded the condemned with the detachment of a scholar examining a failed experiment. His elongated fingers, sheathed in rings of authority, clasped together as he surveyed the boy. Nathaniel Mason, Velser intoned, his voice amplified by hidden speakers embedded in the towering execution dais. You stand accused of inciting rebellion against the sovereign rule of the Wander Dominion. You have conspired to sow insurrection among your own kind, and by extension, against the natural order. The punishment for such treason is death. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. The human slaves pressed together in the shadows, their hunched postures betraying the fear they had learned to cradle like an unwanted, yet ever-present companion. The Wander elite stood at ease, their multicolored eyes flickering with something resembling amusement. There had been executions before, countless ones, but this was different. This was a spectacle. Nathaniel exhaled, his breath visible in the cool evening air. His lips, cracked and bruised, curled into something dangerously close to a smirk. You don't understand what you've done. Velser's nostrils flared slightly, a rare sign of irritation. Enlighten me then, human. You should have looked at my name a little longer, Nathaniel rasped. Mason? The murmurs grew louder now, subtle but spreading. Among the spectators, some exchanged glances, recognizing the name. Others stiffened, sensing the undercurrent of something deeper, something not yet understood. A diplomat's son, a human diplomat's son. That alone should have warranted caution. But Nathaniel saw it in their eyes. Their arrogance had blinded them. That, he thought bitterly, would be their undoing. Velser's expression did not change, though his fingers twitched ever so slightly. It matters not who your progenitor is, human. You are here, standing before judgment. You are alone. Nathaniel shook his head slowly. No, he whispered. I was never alone. The Arbiter flicked two fingers toward the executioner. The masked figure beside Nathaniel stepped forward, pulling the lever. The trapdoor beneath the boy's feet vanished. For a brief, weightless second he fell. The rope went taut. A sharp, hollow snap echoed through the city square. For several moments, silence held dominion. The executioner withdrew. The Supreme Arbiter turned, his cloak billowing as he strode down the dais steps. The Wander nobles began murmuring amongst themselves, already losing interest. The human slaves lowered their gazes, avoiding the sight of yet another of their own left to dangle lifelessly before them. But across the stars, light years away, a man received the news. Inside a private chamber aboard a sleek, imposing vessel, Paul Mason sat motionless as the transmission played. The walls, adorned with shifting holographic displays of intergalactic politics, bathed the room in a muted glow. Andrew Graves stood nearby, his hands clasped behind his back, waiting, watching. The silence stretched, thick with something almost suffocating. The recorded transmission finished its loop. Nathaniel's voice, though garbled by distortion, rang through the chamber one final time. "You don't understand what you've done." Andrew exhaled slowly. "It's confirmed, sir. The Wander executed him an hour ago." Paul did not react immediately. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers before his lips. His face was carved from something colder than stone, his features betraying nothing. Not rage, not sorrow. Just calculation. Andrew shifted his weight slightly, uneasy. Orders? For years, Paul Mason had been the embodiment of diplomacy, the iron-fisted negotiator who had kept humanity's place among the stars from crumbling beneath the weight of superior alien empires. He was known for his ruthlessness, for bending entire planetary systems to his will without ever raising a weapon himself. But this was something new. There was something in his eyes now that Andrew had never seen before. Paul reached forward and tapped the console before him. A new display bloomed into existence, a projection of the Wander Dominion's core systems, its key leaders, its vulnerabilities. His fingers danced across the interface, highlighting territories, calculating movements, paths of least resistance and greatest destruction. It was not diplomacy he was mapping out now. It was war. "They killed my boy," Paul murmured, his voice so even, so calm. It sent a chill through Andrew's spine. The silence stretched between them, and for the first time since he had pledged his loyalty to this man, Andrew wondered if humanity's enemies had any idea what they had just unleashed. Paul's gaze lifted from the map. His lips pressed into a line, his voice soft, yet carrying the weight of a death sentence. "Now I make them pay." The ship rumbled softly beneath them, engines thrumming as it adjusted course. The message had been sent, and the Wander Dominion would soon realize their mistake. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon the name Mason would be written into history, and the galaxy would never forget the cost of what they had done. The silence in the chamber stretched long after Paul Mason had spoken. The air felt thick, heavy with something unspoken, something building like the pressure before a storm. Andrew Graves had seen his superior negotiate with tyrants, outmaneuver entire governments, and bring planetary rulers to their knees with nothing more than words. But this was different. There was no negotiation in his eyes now, only purpose, a sharp-edged inevitability that promised retribution. Paul's fingers glided over the display, scanning through data feeds with a calculated precision. He was already constructing the next steps. Wander-controlled territories flickered into view, planetary strongholds marked in cold blue light. Andrew had seen this process before: analysis, assessment, execution. Only this time, the target was not just a system or a faction. It was an empire. "They wanted to make an example of my son," Paul said at last, his voice smooth but with an undercurrent of ice. "They believed that hanging him in public would break humanity's spirit, that we would fall back in line." He exhaled through his nose, a ghost of a laugh, mirthless and sharp. "They still don't understand what we are." Andrew nodded, his jaw tight. "I've already dispatched contacts to gather intelligence on Derek Vaughn's security networks. The Wander controlled the execution records, but we can find out who was responsible for the decision." Paul didn't look away from the data, his mind moving at a speed few could follow. "We don't just need names. We need leverage. Who signed the execution order? Who pushed for it? Who stood to benefit from Nathaniel's death?" Andrew leaned forward, tapping a command into his wrist console. A projection flared to life, displaying a list of Wander officials. Lord Velser presided over the execution. That much is public knowledge. But I traced encrypted communications between Velser and members of the High Council in the days leading up to it. There were discussions, urgent ones, about human uprisings in the labor colonies. Paul's eyes darkened. They feared an uprising, and they thought executing a single boy would extinguish the spark. His gaze flicked toward Andrew. Then they underestimated how deeply fire can spread. Andrew hesitated, then brought up another feed. There's more. A faction within the Wander Dominion nobles, high-ranking officers, has been growing uneasy with the Supreme Arbiter's rule. They view humanity's resilience as a threat. If the execution was meant as a warning, it might have been their way of pushing for a more aggressive stance against us. Paul absorbed the information in silence, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he exhaled. This isn't just retaliation, Andrew. This is an opportunity. Andrew stiffened. Sir? Paul turned away from the projection and clasped his hands behind his back. If the Wander Dominion is already divided, we do more than punish them for what they've done. We ensure they never recover. His voice was calm, but there was something razor-sharp beneath the surface. We dismantle them, piece by piece. The words hung between them, final and irrevocable. Andrew knew better than to question. Instead, he simply nodded. How do we begin? Paul's gaze returned to the projection, focusing on a single location. We start with Derek Vaughan. The plan unfolded with terrifying precision. Paul was no warrior in the conventional sense. His battlefield had always been the negotiating table, his weapons carefully chosen words, the art of leverage, the ability to see 15 steps ahead. But when diplomacy failed, he did not hesitate to employ more direct means. Andrew moved swiftly, reaching out to informants, smugglers, and even disillusioned Wander officials willing to trade secrets for the right price. Whispers of a human retaliation spread through the underworld, through the labor camps, through the black markets where power shifted like sand. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a captured transmission intercepted from a Wander officer stationed on Derek Vaughan. The message, hastily encoded but clumsily secured, detailed a conversation between Lord Velser and Councillor Zeloth, an influential but cautious member of the High Council. They executed him to send a message. Zeloth's voice crackled through the replay, his tone tight with unease. But they have no idea what that message will bring. We had no choice. Velser's voice was lower, though no less arrogant. Human resistance was growing bolder. If we allowed this Mason boy to continue his rhetoric, the slaves would begin to believe they had power. That could not be allowed. Zeloth's response was sharp. And do you think his father will allow this to stand? You don't understand humans the way I do. Mason is not like the others. You may have just declared war without realizing it. Paul listened to the recording without expression. When it ended, he glanced at Andrew. Zeloth is the weak link. Andrew inclined his head. He seems to understand what's coming. Paul tapped a command into the console. Then we make sure he understands it even more clearly. The meeting was arranged in secret. Zeloth, despite his high position, was not foolish enough to reject the request outright. He had seen what Paul Mason was capable of, and though he still viewed humans as an inferior species, he recognized the danger of underestimating them. The rendezvous took place in a neutral sector, aboard a floating diplomatic station orbiting the gas giant Vados Prime. The setting was sterile, cold, designed to suppress emotion and foster controlled negotiation. Paul arrived precisely on time, dressed in a dark, high-collared suit that exuded authority without the need for embellishment. Andrew stood at his right, silent and watchful. Zeloth was already there, his pale blue skin slick with tension, his elongated fingers twitching slightly as he regarded the human diplomat. Mason, he said by way of greeting, I assume you know why I agreed to this meeting. Paul offered him a cold smile. Because you're smarter than the rest of them. Zeloth's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. You want retribution, but war with the Dominion will cost your people dearly. Paul leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table between them. You misunderstand. This isn't about retribution. This is about restructuring power. Your Dominion is already crumbling. The only question is whether you want to be buried beneath it or be part of what comes next. Zeloth hesitated, his throat tightening in discomfort. You believe you can dismantle an empire? Paul's smile did not waver. I don't believe. I know. Zeloth swallowed, glancing at Andrew, who had yet to speak but whose presence was unmistakably dangerous. Then, slowly, he exhaled. What do you want? Paul sat back, pleased. First names. Every official who signed off on my son's execution. Every noble who pushed for it. Every general who backed it. Then you will begin feeding me intelligence, supply routes, weaknesses, internal conflicts. In exchange, when the Dominion falls, you will have a place in what comes after. Zeloth studied him for a long moment, weighing his options. And if I refuse? Paul's expression did not change. Then you will fall with them. The silence stretched, long and heavy. Zeloth's nostrils flared slightly, but at last he gave a slow nod. I will give you what you need. Paul rose from his seat. Good. Then I will give you what you want. As he turned to leave, Andrew followed a step behind, his voice low. You think he'll betray them? Paul's smirk was almost imperceptible. I think he'll betray whoever is losing. They boarded their ship in silence. As the engines roared to life, Paul Mason watched the stars shift outside the viewport, his mind already constructing the next move. War was not coming. It had already begun. The Galactic Council had not convened in full attendance for over a decade. The Grand Chamber, a circular coliseum suspended in the void of interstellar space, pulsed with a low, mechanical hum. Each seat in the vast ring was occupied by delegates, some of flesh and blood, others encased in cybernetic exoskeletons or floating within pressurized spheres filled with exotic gases. The Wander Dominion's representatives sat toward the eastern quadrant, their posture rigid, their expressions blank masks of barely contained irritation. Paul Mason entered the chamber with the calm of a man who already knew the outcome of the game before the first move had been made. Clad in the deep black of the United Human Territories Diplomatic Corps, he walked without hesitation, each step echoing through the vast hall. Behind him, Andrew Graves moved like a shadow, ever watchful, his hand lingering near the concealed weapon at his waist. At the center of the chamber, a raised platform glowed to life as Paul approached. His gaze swept over the gathered representatives, lingering just long enough to let them feel the weight of his scrutiny. The chamber had been designed for deliberation, for negotiations conducted in layers of veiled threats and half-spoken promises. But today, there would be no pretense. Paul stood before the assembled powers of the galaxy and began to speak. A week ago, he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the hall, my son, Nathaniel Mason, was executed on the orders of the Wander Dominion. His crime? Speaking for his people. For our people. A murmur spread through the chamber, though none dared to interrupt. The news of the execution had spread like wildfire, and though the Wander Dominion had attempted to control the narrative, the truth had reached ears that were not so easily silenced. Paul continued, his expression unreadable. I requested an inquiry. I was denied. I asked for the names of those responsible. I was ignored. I asked for justice. His voice hardened, every syllable razor-sharp. And I was given silence. His gaze shifted, locking onto Supreme Arbiter Velser, who sat stiffly within his section, his slit-pupiled eyes glinting with thinly veiled disdain. The Wander Lord remained still, but Paul could see it, the subtle flicker of discomfort in the way his fingers tightened on the armrest of his throne. I stand before you now not to ask, not to plead, but to warn. Paul's voice was steady, controlled. The Wander Dominion has crossed a line. They have broken the fragile peace that held this galaxy together, and there will be consequences. Velser exhaled slowly before rising from his seat. His robes, crimson and adorned with the intricate insignia of his rank, shimmered under the artificial lighting. When he spoke, his voice carried the practiced arrogance of a ruler who had never known fear. You speak as if humanity holds sway over the fate of this galaxy, he said, his tone dismissive. But what are your people compared to the Dominion? A scattered species, clinging to the fringes of true power? You come here demanding justice, but justice was served. The boy was a traitor. We rid ourselves of a nuisance. The chamber grew still, the weight of the words settling like lead. Paul did not move, his expression betraying nothing. Then he smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the kind of smile that sent a chill through even the most seasoned diplomats in the room. "You mistake me, Arbiter," Paul said, his voice lowering, threading itself with something dark and undeniable. "I did not come here to demand. I came here to announce." A flick of his wrist, a subtle command, and Andrew Graves stepped forward, activating a holographic display. The chamber dimmed as projections of warships, strategic battle movements, and intercepted Wander communications flickered into view. The murmurs turned to outright chaos. "These are movements within Wander-controlled space," Andrew stated, his tone crisp and methodical. "Over the past 72 hours, key supply routes have been compromised. Critical infrastructure in 6 Dominion-controlled colonies has fallen into disarray. Communications have been disrupted. Trade lines severed. Resistance is rising, and not just among humans." Paul clasped his hands behind his back. "You hanged a single human boy, Arbiter. And in doing so, you have set your own house on fire." Velser's nostrils flared. "You would dare—" "I have already dared," Paul interrupted, his tone unwavering. "Even now your grip is slipping. Your own people are questioning your rule. And this is only the beginning." A new projection appeared, this one displaying the face of Counselor Zeloth. The Wander noble's features were tight with strain, his blue skin slightly pallid. "Arbiter Velser," Zeloth's recorded voice echoed through the chamber, "I cannot support this course of action any longer. The execution was a mistake, and you refuse to see it. The humans will not kneel. They never have. And if you continue to press them, you will bring ruin upon us all." Velser's claws dug into the armrests of his throne. Paul tilted his head slightly. "Your council is not united, Velser. Even those closest to you see the writing on the wall." The Arbiter's reptilian gaze narrowed. "You wish to threaten the Dominion with war?" Paul's smile faded. "No. I am stating that it has already begun." Andrew stepped forward once more, his expression unreadable. "The resistance is no longer isolated to the human colonies. Other species under Wander rule have begun to rise. Supply chains have fractured. Military deployments are spread thin." Paul's voice was a blade now. "I do not need to send warships to your doorstep, Arbiter. I only need to let your empire eat itself alive." For the first time, something like doubt flickered in Velser's expression. He knew Paul was right. The Dominion was vast, but it was not invulnerable. And it had never faced an enemy that fought not with armies, but with the slow, methodical unraveling of power itself. Paul let the silence stretch, let the weight of inevitability settle over the chamber. Then, softly, he spoke again. "This is your only warning," he said. "Withdraw from the human colonies. Dismantle your stranglehold on our people. Or be prepared to watch everything you have built crumble." Velser did not respond immediately. His eyes flicked toward the gathered council members, some of whom were watching him with expressions of expectation, others with carefully concealed amusement. He had been backed into a corner, and he knew it. Finally, he spoke, his voice slow, deliberate. "We will consider the matter." Paul inclined his head slightly, though the gesture held no deference. "Do not take too long. The flames are already spreading." With that, he turned and strode from the chamber, Andrew at his side. The doors slid shut behind them, sealing the diplomatic chaos in their wake. As they walked down the sterile halls, Andrew cast a glance at his superior. "Do you think he'll listen?" Paul exhaled through his nose. "No. But it doesn't matter." Andrew raised an eyebrow. "Because?" Paul stopped, looking out through the viewport at the swirling expanse of space. His reflection stared back at him, his face calm, unreadable. "Because I never planned to give him a choice. The stars above Derek Vaughan burned with the cold brilliance of a galaxy on the brink. From the observation deck of the command carrier Vanguard, Paul Mason stood unmoving, his eyes fixed on the shimmering planet below. The capital world of the Wander Dominion, once an untouchable seat of power, now trembled under the weight of inevitability. Andrew Graves stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral. Our forces are in position. The Resistance has already seized control of 3 key orbital defense stations. The Wander fleet is scrambling, but their command structure is fragmented. It's exactly as you predicted. Paul nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the planet, as if listening for the final echoes of history being rewritten. His hands rested behind his back, fingers curled just slightly, the only outward sign of the storm within. Velser still hasn't surrendered. Andrew exhaled sharply. He won't. He's chosen death over submission. Paul tilted his head slightly. Then we grant him his wish. The war had not begun with battleships and orbital bombardments. It had begun in shadows, in whispered betrayals and silent coups. The Dominion had fractured under the weight of its own arrogance, its ruling class too slow to see the tide shifting beneath them. Human resistance cells had become an unstoppable force, striking at vital supply lines, dismantling communication networks, sowing rebellion where once only obedience had thrived. And now, with the Dominion's infrastructure crumbling, the final blow would be delivered. A warning klaxon sounded. The bridge of the Vanguard erupted into precise, controlled motion as officers moved into position. The main view screen flared to life, displaying the incoming Wander fleet. Andrew frowned as he scanned the tactical display. They're desperate. This isn't a coordinated defense. This is a suicide charge. Paul's lips pressed into a thin line. That makes them dangerous. Below, Derek Vaughan's surface ignited with conflict. Explosions rippled through the city districts as human insurgents, armed with stolen Wander technology, pushed through the Dominion's last strongholds. Resistance fighters had infiltrated the palace complex itself, their movements swift and merciless. The final battle was unfolding exactly as Paul had orchestrated. A transmission request flickered on the console before him. Velser. Paul allowed himself a small, satisfied breath. Put him through? The main view screen shifted, revealing the Supreme Arbiter. The once imposing Wander leader now looked almost gaunt, his regal robes torn, his scaled features creased with exhaustion. Behind him, the palace throne room flickered with the remnants of burning banners, smoke curling through the air like the ghosts of a dying empire. Velser's golden eyes locked onto Paul's. You came for blood. Paul's expression was unreadable. I came for justice. A bitter laugh escaped the Arbiter's lips. And this is your justice? War? Chaos? The ruin of an empire? Paul remained silent for a long moment before speaking, his voice quiet but absolute. No. This is balance. Velser's gaze darkened. Humanity will never be satisfied. Even if you destroy me, even if you tear down the Dominion, something will rise in its place. The cycle will continue. Paul's lips curved into something that was almost a smile, but held no warmth. Then I'll make sure what rises fears us. A low tremor shook the palace. Velser's eyes flickered toward the sound, and Paul knew time had run out. The Resistance had breached the throne room's outer defenses. This would be the last conversation the Supreme Arbiter would ever have. Velser exhaled, his expression unreadable. Then do it. Paul's eyes did not waver. Andrew's fingers moved over the console. A moment later, the Resistance leader on the ground confirmed the execution order. Velser's image flickered for a single breath before the feed cut to static. Paul turned from the view screen. Inform the fleet. The Dominion has fallen. The bridge crew moved with military precision, relaying the command across all frequencies. The battle was over. The Wander fleet, leaderless and broken, had already begun to scatter. Some surrendered outright. Others fought to the last. But it no longer mattered. The war had been decided before the first shot was fired. Andrew exhaled, his stance relaxing just slightly. "It's done?" Paul glanced at him, then at the shifting planet below. "No," he murmured. "This is just the beginning." Derek Vaughn belonged to humanity now. The remnants of the Wander Dominion would be dismantled, its wealth repurposed, its resources seized. Other species, long oppressed under the Wander rule, would look to Paul Mason and see not just a Paul, but a force to be feared. The weight of it all settled onto his shoulders, but Paul Mason did not falter. His son had died in chains, hanged before a silent crowd. Now, an empire lay in ruins beneath the stars, a monument to the cost of that mistake. Paul turned toward the viewport one last time, his reflection staring back at him in the cold glass. He had avenged his son. He had reshaped history. And he was not finished yet.